Hello everyone, and welcome. Please join me as we listen to this story. For 20 years, whenever my family asked what I did for work, because of the unusual nature of my job and the things I was not allowed to disclose, I would give them a different answer. Sometimes I said I worked in a warehouse, sometimes that I washed dishes, sometimes that I worked the night shift at a motel. Because of that, my whole family saw me as the biggest failure among them. On my younger sister's wedding day, she pulled me out of the family photo lineup and said, "Stay out of the picture. My husband's family is full of important people. If they find out you've been doing jobs like that, I'll be embarrassed." I quietly stepped aside. A few minutes later, a metal coin slipped from my coat pocket and fell near the feet of a guest seated at the head table. He picked it up, and the moment he saw the symbol engraved on it, he shot to his feet. "Where did you get this?" Then he stared at me, his expression changing completely. "No, it's you. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 43 years old. If you asked my father what I've done for a living over the past 20 years, he would probably have to sit quietly for a moment just to remember all the answers I've given him. One year, I told him I worked in a warehouse in Virginia, inspecting inventory on the night shift. A few years later, I said I was washing dishes at a restaurant near a military base in North Carolina. At one point, I told them I was working the late-night front desk at a motel beside the interstate, where more guests arrived after midnight than during the day. I changed jobs so often that even my mother eventually stopped asking what company I worked for. She only asked the same familiar question every Sunday afternoon. "Are you doing okay this week?" And I always told her I was fine. I left home when I was 23 with 2 suitcases, an old Ford I was still making payments on, and less than $3,000 in my bank account. My father, Frank Morgan, stood on the porch watching me load my things into the car, his face hard as stone. He was the kind of man who believed that a decent life had to come with certain clearly defined things: a steady job, a mortgage paid on time, proper health insurance, and a retirement plan that wouldn't leave your children worrying about you. He had worked nearly 35 years for a construction equipment supplier, had never quit a job simply because he didn't like his boss, and had never moved to another city just because he wanted to try something new. So to him, the next 20 years of my life looked like nothing more than one failed decision after another. But there was one strange thing. I was the child everyone considered the most unstable, yet I almost never disappeared from my family's life. I remembered my parents' birthdays without Facebook reminding me. I knew my mother had her thyroid checked during the second week of March every year. I knew my father liked to pretend his knee didn't hurt because he hated being treated like an old man. I knew the furnace in my parents' house had been making a rattling sound since the previous winter, and I knew my younger sister, Emily, despite being an excellent real estate manager, always forgot to call a repairman until something actually broke. Some weeks, I couldn't call on Sunday at the usual time. When that happened, I would text my mother in advance. "Mom, don't wait for my call. My shifts are all mixed up this week." She usually replied with a heart emoji, followed by, "Make sure you eat properly." She never asked what kind of shift I was working. I never explained. Maybe that was why the story of my life gradually became simpler in my family's mind, in a way that worked very much against me. Claire is unstable. Claire changed jobs again. Claire still hasn't figured out what she wants to do. I remember one Thanksgiving about 8 years ago very clearly. I arrived home almost a full day later than everyone else because my flight had been changed. My parents' house outside Richmond was packed with relatives. Coats covered the rack by the front door, children ran back and forth between the living room and kitchen, and the smells of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie blended together so completely that the moment I opened the door, I felt like I was 17 again. I hadn't even put my bag down when one of my aunts called loudly from the dining table, "Claire, where are you working this time?" I took off my scarf and smiled. "A warehouse." "Still a warehouse?" "Yes." She looked at my father as though the real answer was supposed to come from him. Dad was carving the turkey. His hand paused ever so slightly. Only for a second, but I noticed. "She's still trying to find her direction," he said. Everyone gave a polite little laugh and moved on to another subject. No one meant to hurt me. Maybe that was exactly why those words stayed with me for so long. She's still trying to find her direction. I was already over 35 at the time. I sat down, spread my napkin across my lap, and asked Dad whether his doctor had said anything else about his blood pressure. He frowned and told me not to change the subject, but then he answered anyway. I didn't defend myself or explain my work. I never did. There are some truths that, no matter how badly you want to tell them, do not belong to you alone, so you do not have the right to explain them. So I let them believe the easiest thing to believe, that I was unsuccessful. Emily was the one most bothered by it. She was 8 years younger than me, and almost my complete opposite. She graduated college on time, joined a large real estate company, bought her first townhouse before turning 30, and had a schedule my father could understand just by looking at it. Meetings on Monday, client appointments on Tuesday, bonuses at the end of the quarter, performance reviews at the end of the year. Emily's life fit neatly into little boxes. Mine, in her eyes, looked like a suitcase that had never been fully unpacked. Emily still loved me. I knew that. Whenever I came home, she always had the kind of coffee I liked waiting for me. Once, I came down with a fever right around Christmas, and she drove almost 2 hours through the snow just to bring medicine and chicken soup to the hotel where I was staying. But love does not always come with respect. Sometimes people can love you deeply and still quietly feel ashamed of you. One winter, my parents' heating system broke just as temperatures dropped below freezing. Mom called Emily first, but she was showing a house to a client and said she would deal with it later. About 40 minutes later, Mom called me. At the time, I was more than 600 miles away. I asked 3 questions. Did the house still have electricity? Was there any burning smell coming from the unit? And what was the current temperature in the living room? 15 minutes later, I had found an HVAC company offering emergency service, prepaid the service call fee with my own card, and asked them to prioritize the job because 2 older adults were living in the house. I also arranged for 2 electric space heaters to be delivered from a nearby store, in case the technician didn't have the replacement part immediately available. That evening, Emily called me. "How do you always manage to handle things like this so fast?" "I find the right phone number and call." She was silent for a moment, then she said something I would hear in my head for years afterward. "You're so good at taking care of everyone else. Why can't you take care of your own life?" I was standing in a small rented room when she said that. On the table in front of me was a container of cold food I hadn't had time to open. My coat was still wet from the rain. I looked out at the parking lot below, where the motel lights stretched into long yellow streaks across the wet pavement. I only smiled. "Maybe I am taking care of it." Emily didn't understand. I didn't explain. 2 years later, my father had knee surgery. I couldn't get home on the day he was admitted, but I knew what time the surgery was scheduled. The surgeon's name, what pain medication he had been prescribed, and even that he hated the hospital pillow because it was too soft. I arranged for meals to be delivered to the house during the first 2 weeks of his recovery, hired someone to mow the lawn so he wouldn't secretly hobble outside on his cane, and called my mother every evening to make sure she wasn't trying to lift him out of his chair by herself. Once, Dad snapped at me over the phone. "Take care of your own life, Claire. I'm not old enough to need some daughter who's washing dishes God knows where managing my life." I remember being silent for about 2 seconds. Then I asked, "Did you take your anti-inflammatory pill tonight?" He grumbled, "Yes." "Then we're good." I hung up without getting angry, because for 20 years, my family had only seen what I allowed them to see. A woman who kept changing jobs, no title worth bragging about, no permanent office, no business card my father could place on the table when relatives asked what his oldest daughter did for a living. In their eyes, I was the child who still hadn't found her place at 43. What they didn't know was that I had never truly been lost. I was simply walking a road I was not allowed to show them. In the years that followed, I continued living the same way. I called home almost every week, knew when my father changed his blood pressure medication, knew what days my mother had medical appointments, and knew what was keeping Emily busy at work. Only my job remained a blank space. The whole family had grown accustomed to not understanding. So when Emily told me she was going to marry Ryan Carter, the first thing I cared about was not what his family did or how important they were. I only asked for the wedding date so I could arrange my schedule and come home. I had met Ryan a few times before that. He was 39, worked as a corporate attorney, spoke carefully, and was fairly thoughtful toward my parents. I wasn't close to Ryan, but I had never had any reason to dislike him. During the family dinners we had shared, I noticed that Ryan rarely asked much about my work. Emily had probably told him enough for him to form a picture of her older sister in her 40s, who drifted from place to place and never seemed to have a job stable enough to remember. The wedding took nearly 10 months to plan. Emily worked in real estate, and was used to controlling every detail. But the closer the wedding got, the more small problems piled into one chaotic mess. Guests changed flights, the seating chart had to be revised, the wrong number of flowers was delivered, and hotel rooms for older relatives had not been assigned properly. Whenever she became overwhelmed, she called me. Some days, I would simply listen to Emily talk for 40 minutes, then help her sort every problem by what needed to be handled first. With only 3 days left, she called again and asked me to come home early if I could. I changed my flight. Mom picked me up at Richmond Airport late in the afternoon. The October air was cool, and the trees along the road had already turned red. I carried only a small suitcase and a garment bag containing my dress. The moment Mom saw me, she pulled me into a tight hug, then spent the entire drive home telling me how Dad had misplaced his new shoes. One of my aunts had changed her arrival time, and a vendor was still short several tablecloths. When we reached the house, I finally understood why Emily needed another person. There was barely any room left to put your hand down in the dining room. Gift boxes were stacked along the walls, place cards covered half the table, and several cases of wine and bottled water blocked the garage entrance. Unopened bags of decorations covered the sofa. Dad sat in the middle of all of it wearing his glasses, reading the guest list as though he were reviewing a financial report. Emily heard the door and came running downstairs. She hugged me tightly. I still remember that hug, because Emily truly loved me. What happened later did not erase that. It only made me understand that love and respect do not always grow together. For the 3 days before the wedding, I was barely still for a moment. I drove out to have incorrect place cards reprinted, called the hotel to move 2 rooms closer to the elevator for older relatives, checked the number of high chairs and discovered we were 3 short. I even rushed one bridesmaid's dress to a tailor because the zipper broke the night before the ceremony. They were all small things. But weddings rarely fall apart because of one big problem. They become chaotic because 20 small things happen at the same time, and no one is calm enough to know which one to handle first. On my first night home, the 4 of us ate pizza at the kitchen table, surrounded by unfinished gift boxes. Ryan had gone to his parents' house to deal with something, so it was just the 4 of us. While I was reorganizing the guest list, Emily suddenly mentioned something to me. She said a few members of Ryan's family would be stopping by the next day. If anyone asked about my work, I didn't need to go into too much detail about the times I had worked in a warehouse, washed dishes, or worked at motels. My hand stopped over the stack of papers. I didn't ask why. I understood immediately. Emily said it lightly, as though she were simply reminding me not to forget the right pair of shoes. I continued sorting the papers. I know. That should have been the end of it, but the next morning, while the 2 of us were loading thank you gift bags into the trunk, she brought it up again. Ryan's father had spent many years in the military. Among the invited guests were also lawyers, doctors, people who worked in government, and others Emily badly wanted to make a good impression on. This time, I looked at her a little longer. I was 43 years old. I did not need anyone teaching me how to answer a question about my job. But I said nothing. I simply closed the trunk and kept working. By the morning of the wedding, all of that had nearly been swept away by the rush of activity. The makeup artist arrived early. The flowers were delivered to the hotel. 1 box of decorations was sent to the wrong floor. My father spent nearly 10 minutes looking for his tie, even though it was hanging over the back of the chair right beside him. I moved between rooms, checking the things Emily no longer had time to remember. When she had finished putting on her wedding dress, I stood behind her, smoothed a slight fold in the fabric at her waist, then stepped back to look. In the mirror, Emily looked both nervous and happy. Before leaving the room, she turned around and hugged me one more time. Nothing about that moment made me think that only a few hours later, she would do something I would remember for the rest of my life. The ceremony went smoothly. Ryan waited at the front while my father walked Emily down the aisle between rows of chairs decorated with white flowers. I watched my mother dab her eyes with a tissue for the 3rd time in less than 20 minutes. When Ryan slipped the ring onto Emily's finger, I was genuinely happy. After the ceremony, guests began moving toward the reception area, while the photographer called both families into the garden behind the hotel for the official pictures. First, it was just the bride and groom, then both sets of parents. Then he called the siblings in. I was stepping forward when I felt Emily gently take my arm. She pulled me slightly out of position. I thought something was wrong with her dress, but Emily looked toward Ryan's family before turning back to me. Her voice was very quiet. Stay out of the picture. My husband's family is full of important people. If they find out you've been doing jobs like that, I'll be embarrassed. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at her for a few seconds. Only a few hours earlier, I had been kneeling on the floor, adjusting the hem of her dress. For the past 3 days, I had been running everywhere, handling every little problem so this day could be perfect. But at that moment, the clearest thing in Emily's eyes was not gratitude. It was the fear that I might embarrass her. Behind us, the photographer was waving for everyone to move closer together. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why someone who had worked in a warehouse or washed dishes was somehow unworthy of appearing in her younger sister's wedding photos. I simply nodded. Then I quietly stepped aside. A few seconds later, the camera flashed. My entire family stood inside the frame, and I stood outside it. Even after the photographer finished taking the third picture, no one called me back in. My father was busy adjusting his collar. Mom stood close beside Emily, her eyes still red with emotion. Ryan was leaning down, listening to the photographer explain where everyone should stand for the next shot. Maybe no one except Emily understood why I had suddenly disappeared from the group. I had no intention of making a scene either. It was my younger sister's wedding day. I reminded myself of that and went back inside the hotel. The reception hall was beginning to fill up. Servers moved between tables covered in white linens, adjusting wine glasses and placing small menus beside each setting of silverware. The band was doing a sound check at the far end of the room. Through the glass doors behind me, I could still see my family continuing to take pictures beneath trees that had already turned their autumn colors. I found an empty chair near the hallway and sat down for a few minutes. That was when I realized both of my hands were ice cold. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry in the sense that I wanted to march back outside and demand an explanation from Emily. The feeling was much more uncomfortable than that. It was like walking into a house you had lived in since childhood, seeing everything exactly where it had always been, and suddenly realizing that some door had quietly closed a long time ago without you ever noticing. I bent down and opened the small bag I had brought with me, intending to take out my wallet and check whether I had enough cash to tip the coat check attendant. As I pulled the wallet out, the edge of the bag caught on the inner lining. I leaned down to free it. A small metal object slipped from the coat pocket beside me. It fell onto the marble floor. The sound was a soft clink. But in the quieter space near the head table, it was still loud enough to be heard. The coin rolled away. I watched it. It spun in a small circle, rolled past the leg of a chair, and stopped beside the leather shoes of an older man sitting at the table in front of me. Thomas Carter, Ryan's father. I had met him twice before the wedding, but we had never spoken for more than a few sentences. He was 66 years old, his hair almost entirely gray, and he still stood straight despite having been retired for years. At family gatherings, he spoke little and observed a great deal. Someone had once mentioned that Thomas had spent most of his life serving in the military before retiring with the rank of colonel. I stood up and started toward the coin, but he was faster. Thomas bent down and picked it up between two fingers. I stopped. Just for a moment. Then his expression changed. First, he looked at the front. Then he flipped it over. His thumb slowly passed over the worn symbol in the center and the small numbers engraved near the edge of the metal. He said nothing for several seconds, but I saw his back straighten. That reaction caught my attention more than any words could have. Anyone who has spent enough time in the military learns to notice very small changes in other people. The way they stop breathing. The way their eyes remain fixed on an object a little too long. The way their body unconsciously returns to a posture drilled into them for decades. Thomas shot to his feet. The chair behind him scraped lightly against the floor. Several people nearby turned around. He looked straight at me. "Where did you get this?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the two people talking beside him fall silent. I took another step forward. "It's mine." Thomas did not hand it back. He looked at the coin again. Then at me. The look in his eyes was no longer that of the groom's father looking at the bride's older sister. It was completely different, heavier, more cautious. At that exact moment, the people who had been taking pictures outside began coming back into the hall. Emily entered first with Ryan. Behind them were my parents and several relatives. Emily saw me standing across from Thomas and hesitated slightly. Maybe she thought I had accidentally done something inappropriate. She hurried over. Thomas was still holding the coin. He asked again, "You said this is yours?" I nodded. Emily looked at the object in his hand, then at me. She had seen that coin a few times before but had never paid any attention to it. To most people, there was nothing special about it. The metal had tarnished. The outer edge was scratched in several places. It wasn't gold. It had no gemstones. There were no words on it that were easy to understand. Emily gave a slight laugh, trying to ease the tension. My sister just likes keeping old things. No, he said only one word. Then he looked back at the coin. These aren't sold. The atmosphere around us changed almost immediately. Ryan was now standing beside Emily. My father had also moved closer. Thomas turned the coin between two fingers, so the overhead light clearly illuminated the symbol. He slowly explained that this was not a souvenir coin, nor was it something you could buy at a military store or find at an auction of old memorabilia. It had once been given to a very small group, a special program, about 15 years ago. Thomas did not say the name of the program. I knew he wouldn't, but even that was enough to make Ryan look at me differently. My father frowned. He looked at Thomas, then at me, clearly unable to understand how an old piece of metal could provoke such a strong reaction from a retired military officer. My mother stood silently beside him. Emily looked the most confused of all. Just a few minutes earlier, she had pulled me out of a photograph because she was afraid someone might ask what I did for a living. Now, her own father-in-law was holding something that belonged to me as though it had no business being there. I held out my hand. "Mr. Carter, perhaps you should give that back to me." Thomas did not move. He looked at me for a long time. Then he asked a short question. A question that meant nothing to the people standing around us. He read the 3 small characters beneath the symbol, then asked, "What's the last line?" I did not answer immediately. I looked around. Ryan, Emily, my parents, 2 relatives who had just walked over, a server standing a few steps away, clearly sensing that something unusual was happening. I looked back at Thomas. He was still waiting. I knew exactly what he was asking. Not the number engraved on the coin, but the verification phrase that had once been used with that symbol. I had not spoken it aloud in many years. I lowered my voice, just enough for Thomas to hear clearly. No one gets left behind beyond the second door. Every expression vanished from his face. Thomas looked at me as though he had just heard a voice from the past. Then he straightened completely. Not like an older man attending his son's wedding, like an officer. I recognized the reflex immediately. His shoulders pulled back, his chin lifted slightly. The hand holding the coin dropped close to his side. He stared at me for a few more seconds. "Chief Morgan." I said nothing. Thomas almost whispered the next words. "Is it really you?" Ryan whipped his head toward me. Emily stood frozen. My mother's eyes moved from Thomas to her daughter, completely unable to understand what had just happened. Only my father reacted out loud. Frank stepped forward. I had never seen that expression on his face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't exactly confusion. It was the look of a man who had just heard someone address his daughter by a title that could not possibly exist within the story he had believed for 20 years. Dad looked directly at Thomas. "What did you just call my daughter?" My father's question caused several people nearby to turn fully toward us. Thomas was still holding the coin. I looked at him, then around the reception hall. In less than a minute, attention had already begun shifting in our direction. One of Ryan's relatives standing nearby had stopped talking. 2 servers slowed as they walked past. Emily stood beside her husband, her face rigid. I knew that if Thomas said even one more sentence, this would no longer remain a conversation among a few family members. I stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, that's enough." Thomas looked at me. I did not need to say much more. He understood immediately. I lowered my voice. "Today is Emily's wedding day." Thomas remained silent. "And there are things that should not be discussed here." His expression changed slightly. The shock was still there, but the rest of him had returned to the man who had spent decades in an environment where you learned when to ask questions and, more importantly, when to stop asking them. He looked down at the coin one last time, then placed it in my palm. "Understood." I closed my fingers around it. Dad was still standing beside us. He didn't understand. I could see it in the way his brow furrowed, in the way his eyes kept moving between Thomas and me. "Wait." Dad stepped forward. "What does Chief mean? Why did he call you that?" I looked at him. "Not now." "Claire, Dad." I didn't raise my voice. But he stopped. I rarely used that tone with him. I turned toward Emily. She was still standing motionless, one hand gripping the fabric of her wedding dress a little tighter than usual. "Go greet your guests." Emily opened her mouth as though she wanted to ask something. I gave the slightest shake of my head. "This is your day." Maybe that was what made everything even stranger. I didn't explain. I didn't take out the coin and show it off. I didn't tell them who I was. I didn't correct the story my family had believed for 20 years. I simply slipped the coin back into my pocket, adjusted the zipper of my jacket, and stepped aside to let a group of guests pass. The band began playing the first song in the main hall. Only a few minutes later, the MC announced the bride and groom. Emily and Ryan had to make their entrance. Everyone applauded. Everything continued as though nothing had happened. But from that moment on, I knew no one in my family was truly focused on the wedding the way they had been before, especially Ryan. Throughout dinner, I caught him looking at me several times, not with ordinary curiosity. Ryan was an attorney. He was used to hearing a story and noticing the parts that did not add up. And for the first time, perhaps he was beginning to realize that the story he had heard about me had far too many gaps. A 43-year-old woman who had spent 20 years unable to hold down a job, warehouse work, dishwashing, motel night shifts, no title, no clear career. Yet a retired military colonel had seen a coin in that woman's pocket and shot to his feet. Then he had called her by a title no one in her family had ever heard before. The strangest thing was not that Thomas knew me. It was that I had immediately stopped him from saying anything more. I think that was what caught Ryan's attention most. If I had ever wanted to impress anyone, that would have been the perfect opportunity. I didn't take it. I sat at the family table, talked with my mother, helped Dad cut a piece of beef because his hand was still slightly stiff from the time he had spent using crutches, then got up to bring my mother a glass of water when she coughed lightly. When a relative asked where I was working these days, I gave the same answer I always had. I move around a lot. That was all, nothing more. Thomas did not ask another question for the rest of the evening. But at one point, when I passed his table, our eyes met. He only nodded. I nodded back. That was enough. The wedding ended close to 11 that night. Guests gradually began leaving. The flowers on the tables had started to droop slightly. Half-finished glasses of champagne were scattered throughout the hall. Hotel staff had begun cleaning up in the distance while the last few relatives hugged Emily and Ryan goodbye. I stayed behind to help Mom gather the leftover gift bags. Dad barely spoke to me. I knew he was waiting. I also knew that conversation could no longer be avoided. Close to midnight, we returned to my parents' house. Emily and Ryan stopped by as well to change clothes and pick up a few things before leaving the next morning. Thomas did not come with them. Before leaving the hotel, he had only told me that we could talk another time. I was grateful for that. The moment the front door closed, Dad dropped his keys onto the table harder than usual. Mom had not even taken off her coat yet. Dad turned to look at me. "Can we talk now?" The living room went completely silent. Emily stood near the stairs. Ryan was beside her. I set my bag down on a chair. "What do you want to know?" That question made him angry. "You're actually asking me what I want to know?" His voice rose for the first time that day. 20 years, Claire. I stood still. For 20 years, I haven't known what my own daughter does for a living. He pointed at me, but his hand trembled slightly. "One time you say you work in a warehouse, then you're washing dishes, then you're working nights at a motel. Some years you said you were unemployed for months." I sat in front of relatives and told them you were still trying to find your direction, like some 30-something-year-old kid who didn't know what she wanted out of life. Mom softly said his name. Frank did not stop. "And today, a military colonel sees something in your pocket and calls you by a title your own father has never even heard before." He looked directly at me. "What have you been doing for the past 20 years? It was a question I had been preparing for a very long time, but being prepared did not make answering it easy. I pulled out a chair and sat down. No one else did. I looked at my parents first, then at Emily and Ryan. "I can't tell you everything." Dad gave a dry laugh. "Even now?" "Yes." He turned his face away. I continued before he could say anything else. "But I can tell you part of it." The room went silent. I had spent nearly 20 years avoiding the sentence that came next. Finally, I said it. "My work has involved intelligence, counterintelligence, and military security." No one moved. Emily was the first whose expression changed. Ryan looked at me, but this time there was no longer curiosity in his eyes. Dad stood motionless, as though he had not fully understood what he had just heard. I continued. "There were periods when I worked directly on operations my family was not allowed to know about. There were places where I couldn't tell anyone where I was. There were people I couldn't say I was meeting. And there were years when even describing my work in general terms could have put the people around me in a position they should never have been placed in." Dad stared at me for a long time. "Are you a spy?" I almost smiled. "It's not that simple. Then what are you? I just told you what I'm allowed to say. Dad paced a few short circles around the living room, then stopped in front of the window. I understood his anger. It did not come only from having been kept in the dark. It came from 20 years of memories changing meaning all at once. The calls I didn't answer. The Christmases I missed. The times I said I had changed jobs. The months when I disappeared and then reappeared as though nothing had happened. Everything Dad had once used as evidence that my life was unstable suddenly meant something entirely different. He turned around. I'm your father. I know. Don't say, I know. You don't know. He pointed at his own chest. I worried about you. His voice dropped. There were nights when your mother called and you didn't answer. I thought you had lost another job, moved again, gotten yourself into some kind of trouble you refused to tell us about. One time I was ready to get in the car and go looking for you. I looked at Mom. She lowered her eyes. I hadn't known that, Dad continued. Do you know what it feels like to watch the daughter you once thought was the smartest one in the family reach 40 with nothing stable in her life? That hurt. Not because he was trying to hurt me, but because he was telling the truth. That was exactly what Dad had thought of me, and I had allowed him to think it. I said slowly, I know. No, you don't know. He shook his head. Because if you did, you would have said something. Just one sentence. I looked at him. Frank stood there at 71 years old, his shoulders slightly more stooped than they had been a few years earlier, his face still flushed with anger, but his eyes were different now. It was no longer anger. It was hurt. Finally, he asked the question he had probably been holding on to since we left the hotel. Why would you rather let me think you were a failure than say one sentence telling me you were serving your country? No one in the room spoke. Emily lowered her head. Ryan stood silently beside her. Mom looked at me with reddened eyes. I had answered harder questions in my life, but none of them had ever taken me as long to answer as that one. I looked at Dad, because there were years when even that sentence would have been too much. He remained silent. I did not explain further right away. There were times when simply knowing what agency I belonged to, where I served, or what field I worked in would have created a connection that did not need to exist. One careless comment over dinner, one photograph posted in the wrong place, one answer given to someone who should never have asked sometimes that alone was enough to ruin months of preparation. But I did not say those things as an excuse. I only said what mattered most. I didn't hide it because I didn't trust you or Mom. Mom looked up. And I have never been ashamed of my family. I glanced briefly at Emily, then looked back at Dad. I only did what I believed I had to do. Dad sat down in the chair across from me. The anger seemed to drain out of him too quickly, leaving behind a kind of exhaustion I had never seen before. After a while, he spoke very quietly. I've said a lot of bad things about you. I knew what he was remembering. The times he criticized me for not being able to hold down a job. The times he told me I needed to grow up. The times he told relatives that I was still trying to find my direction. I did not want him punishing himself with those memories. Dad. He looked at me. I didn't know. Just 4 words. He said nothing else. I continued. You and Mom couldn't understand something I never allowed either of you to know. I didn't blame Dad. I didn't blame Mom either. They had assembled the picture using the pieces I gave them. Their only mistake was believing those pieces were the entire picture. That night, for the first time in 20 years, Dad looked at me without asking what I did for a living, but I knew an even bigger question had appeared in his mind. Over the past 20 years, how much had he really known about his own daughter? That night, after Dad asked how much he had truly known about his daughter over the past 20 years, the room stayed silent for a long time. No one got up. No one mentioned how late it was or Emily's trip the next morning. It felt as though everyone understood that if the conversation ended there, what had just been revealed would only make the distance between us greater. I looked at Dad, then at Mom. Finally, I decided to explain one more thing I had never imagined I would have to explain. There's something you both need to understand. Dad looked up. All those jobs I told you about, they weren't completely made up. Emily, standing near the stairs, frowned slightly. I picked up the bottle of water on the table, opened it, and took a sip. I needed a few seconds to organize what I could say and what still had to remain undisclosed. There were years when I really did work in warehouses. There were months when I really did wash dishes in restaurant kitchens. There were nights when I really did sit behind the front desk of a motel near the highway, checking guests' identification as they arrived, replacing hallway light bulbs, calling someone to repair the vending machine, and dealing with drunk guests knocking on doors at 2 in the morning, I had done all of those things. The only difference was that the reason I was there was not what my family thought it was. I explained that those jobs usually lasted a few weeks, sometimes a few months. They were ordinary enough that no one paid attention, yet they placed me exactly where I needed to be to observe the things most people overlooked: which routes shipments traveled through, who had access to restricted areas, which contractors showed up outside the scheduled hours, who regularly met with whom at unreasonable times, why a certain shipment kept changing identification numbers, or why someone appeared to be living far beyond the income they officially reported. I did not name the unit. I did not name the operations. I did not say how many people were being watched or what happened afterward. I said only enough for them to understand. A warehouse is not just a place filled with boxes stacked on pallets. A restaurant does not only have cooks and servers. A motel beside an interstate does not only have travelers stopping for the night. Sometimes, the most ordinary places are the best places to see the things other people assume no one is noticing. Dad sat very still. I could see him remembering every phrase he had ever used about me. His daughter worked in a warehouse. His daughter washed dishes. His daughter worked nights at a motel. The jobs he had once heard about with disappointment, and sometimes even embarrassment, when he had to repeat them to relatives, had not been fragments of a failed life after all. They had been part of my real work. Mom was the first to speak. So those times you called home and said you had just gotten off work? I nodded. Sometimes I really had just gotten off a shift. She looked at me longer. And those times your hands were burned from the kitchen? That was real too. I still remember one summer many years ago, when I worked for 6 weeks in the kitchen of a restaurant that served travelers along a major highway. The evening shift started at 4 in the afternoon and usually ended after midnight. I washed dishes, took out the trash, mopped floors, and carried boxes of frozen food from delivery trucks into the storage room and back. Once, hot oil splattered onto my wrist, leaving a small scar my mother later noticed at Thanksgiving. She felt sorry for me. Dad got angry. He told me that I was over 30 years old and still washing dishes until I burned myself, and that I needed to seriously rethink my life. I didn't blame him. At the time, from his perspective, that was exactly what it looked like. Ryan sat down in the chair near Emily. From the beginning of the conversation, he had barely interrupted, but his expression had changed completely from the way it had been at the hotel. Maybe Ryan was beginning to understand that a person could tell the truth without telling the whole truth. Emily would not look at me. She was staring at the floor. Then suddenly she looked up. "Virginia." I looked at her. Emily slowly stepped closer to the table. "There was one time you said you were working at a warehouse in Virginia." I knew exactly which period she meant before she even continued. About 12 years earlier. At the time, I told my family I was working the night shift at a large distribution center. I called home fairly regularly for almost 2 months. Mom even mailed me a pair of warm gloves because I had once complained that the warehouse was too cold. Then I disappeared for almost 3 months. No Sunday calls. Only an occasional very short text message. I had told them I had been moved to another shift and that using my phone was inconvenient. Emily remembered. "I called you on your birthday and couldn't reach you." I remained silent. "Dad even said you had probably quit another job." I didn't answer. Emily looked at me as though, for the first time, she was placing old memories side by side, instead of looking at each one separately. "Then you came home." I remembered. I came home one February afternoon, almost 13 pounds lighter, with shorter hair and 2 healed cuts on my right hand. I stayed home for only 2 days. I told everyone the warehouse job wasn't a good fit, so I had quit. Dad was so angry that he barely spoke to me through dinner. Emily also thought I had ruined yet another job. Now she looked at me. "You didn't quit." I neither confirmed nor denied it. I only said, "Sometimes I had to leave a place without being able to explain why." That was enough. Emily sat down. Then I saw her remember something else. North Carolina. This time her voice was quieter. Another winter. I had once told them I was working the night shift at a motel outside Raleigh. The job sounded so bad that Dad offered to send me money so I could come home and find something else. I refused. I told him I was fine. Then, Christmas came, and I didn't come home. Mom had prepared my room like she did every year. Dad had bought the coffee I liked. Emily had even saved me a slice of pecan pie because I had said I wanted some. I called on the morning of the 23rd. I told them the motel was short-staffed and I had to work. Dad was furious. He hung up before I finished speaking. The truth was, by Christmas Eve that year, I was no longer at the motel. But that was the part I could not tell them. Emily stared at me. You said you had to work over the holiday. I nodded. That was the answer I was able to give at the time. She closed her eyes for a moment. I knew she was remembering other things too. The times I changed phone numbers. The times mail was returned because I had moved. The birthdays when I called several days early and then disappeared. The periods when I could talk to Mom for hours every Sunday night, then suddenly send nothing but a few short text messages for weeks. For 20 years, my family had looked at each event separately and seen an unstable woman. Now, for the first time, they were placing everything side by side, and the picture was beginning to change. Emily sat there, still wearing the simple dress she had changed into after the wedding reception, her hands resting on her knees. Only a few hours earlier, she had been afraid that someone might find out her older sister had once washed dishes or worked nights at a motel. Now she was beginning to understand something. The jobs she had been most ashamed of had never been proof that I was a failure. They were simply parts of my life she had seen, but never truly understood. Old memories began connecting with one another, but the more Emily remembered, the quieter she became. I looked at her and realized that, for the first time in many years, she was no longer trying to find a simple explanation for my life. No more, she changed jobs again. She moved again. She couldn't come home again. The gaps my family had always interpreted as instability now appeared as spaces that had been deliberately left blank. My mother had been sitting silently all this time. Then she stood up. No one asked where she was going. Mom left the living room, walked down the hallway, and disappeared into the small room behind the kitchen where she had always kept boxes of photographs, old documents, and Christmas decorations from years past. About 2 minutes later, she returned carrying a brown cardboard box. I recognized it immediately. I just didn't know she still had it. She placed the box on the table and removed the lid. Inside were not valuable things. A stack of old birthday cards, faded postcards, flower delivery receipts, receipts for gifts sent from stores in different states. A few scraps of paper I had once scribbled notes on and slipped into gift boxes. Mom took out the first card. It was more than 15 years old. That year, I had not been able to come home for Dad's birthday. I sent him a new watch because the strap on his old one had broken. Dad called and scolded me for almost 10 minutes because he thought I was wasting money when my job wasn't even stable. He wore that watch for 8 years. Mom placed the card down and picked up another receipt. Flowers sent on my parents' wedding anniversary. A Christmas gift I sent Emily when she was 27. A small note I wrote to Mom after she had to undergo a biopsy. Don't read too much online. Wait for the doctor to tell you. I'll call Sunday night. I remembered that sentence. I did not remember where I had written it. Maybe Virginia, maybe Maryland, or maybe somewhere else entirely that I was still not allowed to mention. Mom opened another envelope. Inside was a printed email confirmation for a grocery order I had once sent to the house when Dad had a severe case of the flu. Then a receipt from the heating repair company. A card I sent Emily when she got promoted. An old photograph of a bouquet left outside Mom's front door on Mother's Day. Nearly 20 years. Not something from every single year, but enough to make the box heavy. Mom rested her hand on the edge of the box. She never disappeared from this family. Dad looked at her. Mom did not look at me. Maybe if she did, she would cry. She just continued taking things out one by one. Sometimes she couldn't call. But if she knew you had a doctor's appointment, she called ahead of time. If something happened with Emily, she sent a message. If something in the house broke, she found someone to fix it. If she couldn't come home for Christmas, the gifts still arrived early. Dad stared at the box for a long time. I did not need those things to prove that I was a good daughter. I also did not want Mom to turn the conversation into a trial, where I stood on the right side and everyone else stood on the wrong side. But that box said something perhaps none of them had ever considered before. I could disappear from a city, disappear from a job, disappear from the phone for a few weeks. But I had never truly disappeared from my family. I knew when Dad needed someone to drive him after surgery. I knew which medication Mom often forgot to take. I knew Emily had cried for 3 days after her first breakup, even though she told everyone she was fine. There were years when I could not say where I was, but I always knew what was happening at home. Emily looked at the cards spread across the table. Then she started to cry. Not loudly. The tears simply ran down her face before she could wipe them away. Then why didn't you tell us? I looked at her. Emily raised her head. If you had just told us a little sooner, If you had only said you were working for the military or doing something important, then no one would have thought of you that way. I did not answer immediately. The more she spoke, the more upset she became. Dad wouldn't have had to feel embarrassed when relatives asked, and I wouldn't have. Emily stopped, but the rest of the sentence was already obvious. She wouldn't have been ashamed of me. I stood up. Emily. She wiped her tears. I didn't know. I know. No, you don't understand. For all these years, you let everyone think you couldn't do anything with your life. You heard Dad say those things. You heard me say those things. You could have stopped all of it with one sentence. Her voice began to rise. Ryan stood behind her but did not interfere. I looked at my younger sister. And what if I didn't have that sentence? Emily froze. I slowly stepped closer. What if everything you ever knew about me had been true? She looked at me. What if I really did just work in a warehouse? I paused. What if I really did wash dishes to pay my rent? Emily said nothing. What if I really did work nights at a motel because that was the best job I could find at the time? The room fell silent again. I looked directly at her. Then what? Tears were still on Emily's face. I asked the question I had not allowed myself to think about for too long since standing outside in the hotel garden. What if I really did just wash dishes? Emily lowered her eyes slightly. I continued. Would I have deserved to be pulled out of the photograph? No one said anything. Even Dad remained silent. I wasn't asking to hurt Emily. I wasn't asking to force her to apologize. I only wanted her to understand that this had not begun with me hiding an important job. It had begun with something much simpler. She had believed that my worth changed depending on what job I did. That if I really were just a 43-year-old woman washing dishes in a restaurant, I could still be a good sister, the daughter who called home every week, the person who paid to repair my parents' heating system, the person who flew home 3 days early to take care of every chair at the wedding, and still not be good enough to stand in a photograph. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. There was no answer. I looked at her for a few seconds, then turned back toward the box on the table. The cards were still there. The old receipts, the faded scraps of paper. All of them had been sent by someone the family once believed could not even take care of her own life. At that moment, I realized something I still remember to this day. The truth about my work could change the way they looked at the past. But if that was the only thing that made them start respecting me, then we still had a much bigger problem to face. That question left the room silent for a very long time. No one looked at me anymore as though I had just been vindicated. Maybe because, for the first time, everyone was beginning to understand that the problem was not whether I had an impressive job. The problem was that they had allowed a job title to determine how they saw someone in their own family. Mom was the one who broke the silence. She was still standing beside the old box on the table, one hand resting on the faded cards. I saw her hesitate for a long time before pulling out a chair and sitting down. Frank, there's something else you don't know. Dad turned toward her. Mom looked at me. One glance was enough for me to know what she was about to say. I gave a slight shake of my head, but this time, Mom did not listen to me. It's about your heart surgery. Dad frowned. 3 years earlier, Dad had undergone major surgery after doctors discovered that 3 of his arteries were severely blocked. The operation was successful, but even after insurance, there was still an amount my parents could not immediately manage on their own. Nearly $46,000. I remember that number very clearly. Dad had already retired by then. Most of their savings were tied up in retirement accounts and the house. Emily had recently bought property of her own and was still paying off a large loan. Dad absolutely refused to sell the house, and he did not want to borrow more money. Then, a few weeks later, Mom told everyone that a support fund for older patients had covered most of the remaining balance. Dad believed her. Emily believed her too. I never corrected the story. Mom opened a small compartment at the bottom of the box and took out a stack of papers folded in half. I immediately recognized the payment receipts. She placed them in front of Dad. There was no support fund. Dad did not touch the papers. He looked at Mom. What did you say? Mom swallowed hard. Claire paid it. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Dad turned toward me. I said nothing. Mom continued, her voice quieter. She transferred the money to the hospital in 3 payments, almost all of what she had saved. Dad pulled the papers closer. The payer's name did not appear directly on the first copy, but the transfers, dates, and amounts were all there. 18,000, 15,000, 12,000, and several hundred. Nearly $46,000. Dad read every line. then read them again. I looked at his hands. The fingers that had once trembled slightly while carving a Thanksgiving turkey were now holding a sheet of paper so thin it barely weighed anything. Emily looked at me. "Where did you get that kind of money?" I did not answer right away, not because the question was difficult, but because I knew the number was not what truly hurt them. I had used almost all of my personal savings at the time, money I had saved for years. Part of it was for a house I once thought I might buy when my work became more stable. Part of it was for retirement. Part of it was simply so I would know that if something ever happened one day, I would not have to call my parents and ask for help. After the payment, I had less than $6,000 left in my account. I did not tell them that. I only said, I had the money. Dad looked up. "You had the money?" His voice broke. I knew he was remembering how much he had thought I was struggling. The old cars I drove, the small rooms I rented, the times I refused to buy new things, the years I said I was working night shifts at motels. Dad looked at Mom. "You knew about this?" Mom nodded. "Claire made me promise not to tell you." Dad turned toward me. "Why?" This time, I did not avoid the question. "Because you were recovering." "No." He shook his head. "It wasn't just that." I stayed silent. Mom answered for me. "She was afraid you wouldn't accept it." Dad looked at her. Mom clasped her hands together tightly. She said, "If you knew the money came from Claire, you would give it back, or you would sell something just to repay her." Dad did not argue, because everyone in the room knew it was true. Mom looked at me, her eyes turning red. She said one more thing. I knew she was about to repeat it. I did not want to hear it, but she said it anyway. "She told me not to let you feel indebted to the daughter you still thought couldn't even take care of herself." Dad lowered his head. This time, no one said anything else. I watched him place both hands on his knees and stare down at the carpet as though he were trying to recover a memory that had been lying undisturbed for 3 years. Then his expression changed. I knew he had remembered. It was about 6 weeks after the surgery. Dad had come home, still walking slowly and taking a long list of medications on a strict schedule. At the time, I said I was working night shifts at a motel outside North Carolina. One evening, Dad called me. He was upset because I could not come home that weekend. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. Dad had said something he had probably forgotten long ago. "You're 40, Claire. When are you going to stop working night shifts in places like that and finally settle down?" I remember sitting alone in a rental car at the time, parked beneath the cold white lights of a gas station. I had just received the email confirming the final payment for Dad's hospital bill. I did not explain. I did not tell him that the money he was worried about had already been taken care of. I did not tell him where I had gotten it. I only asked one question. "Did you take your medication?" Dad was irritated at the time. Then he answered that he had. I reminded him not to forget his evening pill and hung up. Now, 3 years later, Dad was sitting in front of me, remembering the entire conversation. I saw him open his mouth, but no sound came out. For the first time in my life, my father could not find anything to say. He only looked at me, and perhaps for the first time, he understood just how long my silence had lasted. Dad continued looking at me for a long time, but after learning about the hospital bill, he did not ask another question that night. Maybe there comes a point when a person no longer has the strength to keep opening old doors all in the same day. Emily and Ryan left well after midnight. Mom put the box back in the room behind the kitchen. I went upstairs to my old bedroom, but I barely slept. The coin was still in the pocket of my coat draped over the chair. I did not take it out. I had never liked looking at it for too long. The next morning, Thomas called Ryan and asked him to pass along a message that he wanted to see me before they left the city. I agreed. We met at a small diner not far from the hotel. My parents came with me. Emily and Ryan were there too, sitting at a table farther inside, close enough to hear if we allowed them to. Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked at me. He did not ask about the mission. He did not ask the name of the unit. He did not ask where I had been. The first thing he asked was whether he was allowed to explain the meaning of the coin to my family. I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Only the part you know can be made public." Thomas understood. He looked at my father before beginning. "What I picked up yesterday wasn't a medal." Dad frowned slightly. Maybe all night he had imagined something different. Thomas went on to explain that coins like that were sometimes made specifically for a very small group after a program or mission ended. They were not meant to be worn. There was no official award record attached to them. They were not something displayed in a glass case. They were simply given to the people who had been there. Then he paused. And the mission connected to this coin ended very badly. I looked down at the table. The smell of hot coffee suddenly seemed too strong. 15 years had passed, but some memories do not grow old. They simply settle somewhere deeper. Thomas did not give details. He did not know all of them either. But he knew enough. My team completed the work we had been assigned. Not everyone came home. 2 people died. I had worked with both of them long enough to know that one always called his son before every trip, while the other had a habit of folding his napkin into a triangle no matter where he ate. Very small details. Those are often the things that remain the longest. After that mission, there was a private recognition ceremony. I was offered several forms of more official recognition. I refused to carry them with me, not because I did not value them, but because every time I looked at them, the first thing I remembered was not what I had accomplished. I remembered the 2 people who never had the chance to stand at that ceremony, so I kept only the coin. Small, old, worth nothing in monetary terms. Small enough to fit in a pocket. Thomas looked at me. I recognized it because I once saw one just like it in a memorial file for someone. Dad turned toward me. I knew he wanted to ask whose name, but this time, he did not. Maybe he was beginning to understand that not every question needed an answer. Emily looked at the pocket of my coat. "You've carried it with you all this time?" I nodded. Not all the time, but on important days I often did. My younger sister's wedding was one of those days. Not for anyone to see. Only to remember that some people never got the chance to come home and attend their siblings' wedding, have dinner with their parents, or hear a Sunday phone call. Thomas said a few more things, then stopped. There was no praise. I was grateful for that. I did not want the story of the 2 people who died to become part of some dramatic reveal about who I was. When we left the diner, Dad walked beside me toward the parking lot. He was silent for quite a while. Then, suddenly, he said he was going to call Uncle George that afternoon. I looked at him. Why? He's been asking about you for years. I understood immediately. Dad began naming a few other people. An aunt in Ohio. 2 relatives who had been sitting at that Thanksgiving dinner years ago. An old friend who always asked what Frank Morgan's oldest daughter was doing these days. Dad's voice had changed. The embarrassment was gone. Now there was pride. Maybe he thought that was how he could correct the past 20 years. Emily was the same way. That afternoon, when the photographer sent over a few preview pictures, she immediately said she would call him and arrange another private photo session before I left. She wanted pictures of me standing in the middle of the family. Pictures with Ryan, pictures with Thomas. She even talked about choosing a good one to place beside the wedding portrait. I listened for a while, then stopped her. "There's no need." Emily froze. Dad looked at me too. I knew they meant well. That was exactly why I had to say it right away. I don't want yesterday to be something you were ashamed of, and today to become something you show off. The room grew quiet. I looked at Dad. I don't need Uncle George to know. Then I looked at Emily. And I don't need the whole wedding photographed again. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I spoke more slowly. I just want to still be Claire. Not Chief Morgan. Not someone who did secret work. Not a story to tell over dinner about how Frank's daughter turned out to have done something extraordinary. Just Claire, the person who still called home on Sundays. The person who remembered Mom's medical appointments. The person who had worked in warehouses, washed dishes, worked nights at motels. Whatever the reasons behind those jobs, none of them had ever made me less than anyone else. Dad looked at me for a long time. This time, he did not argue. Neither did Emily. Maybe that was when they truly understood. Not when Thomas recognized the coin. Not when they learned I had worked in intelligence-related fields. Not when they discovered I had paid nearly $46,000 in medical bills, but when they understood that I did not need a bigger identity to deserve a place in my own family. A few months later, on a Sunday afternoon, I called home just as I had for the past 20 years. Mom answered first. She told me Dad had forgotten to buy milk again, even though he had written it on the list. She told me the maple tree in the front yard was dropping too many leaves. She told me Emily and Ryan had stopped by for dinner the night before. A little while later, Dad took the phone from her. I waited for the familiar questions. "Where are you? What are you doing for work these days? When are you moving again?" But he did not ask. He was silent for a few seconds, then said only, "Are you doing okay this week?" I sat beside the window, watching the late afternoon sunlight stretch across the parking lot below. "I'm doing okay." That was all. Before we hung up, Mom said she had sent me a picture. I opened the message. It was a photograph taken in my parents' dining room. Emily and Ryan sat on one side, my parents sat on the other. The large wedding portrait of Emily was still hanging on the wall behind them. But beside it, there was now a smaller frame. A photograph taken the morning after the wedding. I was standing between my parents and Emily. No uniform, no medals, no coin in my hand. No one looking at that picture could possibly know what I had done for the past 20 years. And this time, it no longer mattered. Because in that picture, no one told me to stand outside. Thank you for listening to the story. Please subscribe and leave a comment so I can have more inspiration to tell you the next stories.